quiet chemist, a locked drawer, a secret no one was meant to find. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. It's always exciting to hear from new viewers. Share where you're tuning in from. You all make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. It was on an unusually damp June morning in the quiet town of Kettering Vale that Mr. Lionel Gudgeon was found dead behind the counter of his own chemist shop. To the untrained eye, the scene was almost serene. The pale blue glass bottles lined the shelves in neat military rows. A scent of lavender, eucalyptus, and something faintly acidic lingered in the air, clinging to the mahogany counters and the black and white tiled floor, like the last whisper of a vanished client. The body had slumped against the display drawers, one arm outstretched toward the till, as though reaching for something, or perhaps someone. Mr. Gudgeon's spectacles were cracked where they had hit the wooden floor, and a small silver vial lay near his fingertips. It had no label. The constable who first arrived at the scene, young Harold Shepherd, was not one to leap to conclusions. He had called for the local physician, Dr. Greaves, who arrived at the scene and, after a quiet moment of examination, confirmed death by poisoning. "But I cannot say," he muttered, dabbing his nose with a spotted handkerchief, "what the poison was. There's no obvious sign, no contortion, no vomiting, no discoloration. It's as if he simply slipped away." Within the hour, Inspector Flint of the Kettering Police was called to the scene. A broad-shouldered man with a worn moustache and a habit of rubbing the bridge of his nose when thinking, Flint was a man well liked by the town, but frequently baffled by the subtleties of human motive. "No signs of forced entry," he muttered as he scribbled into his notebook. "Cash drawer untouched. And you say the door was locked from the inside?" "Indeed," said Constable Shepherd. "We had to go round the back, through the alley door. It was unlatched. Odd, that." "Odd indeed." By mid-morning, the quiet street was alive with whispers. The postman, Mr. Latchbury, claimed to have seen Miss Alma Renfield, Mr. Gudgeon's assistant, enter the shop just before opening hours and rush out 10 minutes later, white as a ghost. Mrs. Bertram, from the bakery across the road, swore she'd heard shouting the night before, something about a will and lies too long hidden. The trouble was, in Kettering Vale, everyone knew everyone, and Mr. Gudgeon had been a fixture, punctual, polite, perhaps a touch secretive, but never cruel. He lived alone above the chemist's, rarely entertained, and walked with a slight limp from a great war injury. A man with few enemies, said some, but others shook their heads. No one works among poisons for 30 years without understanding how to use them. It was precisely at 1:47 p.m. that a motor car of modest elegance pulled into the square, catching the eye of several townsfolk who had assembled behind the constable's cordon. A man emerged from the vehicle, slight in build but impeccably dressed, grey gloves, black patent shoes polished to a mirror's shine, and a bowler hat perched upon his oiled head. His moustache, magnificent, dark, and symmetrical, curled like the feathers of a particularly proud peacock. He stood quite still, surveying the facade of the chemist's shop, with his head tilted slightly to one side. Poirot had arrived. The invitation had come not from the local authorities, but from an old acquaintance, Lady Constance Harborough, whose estate lay just 4 miles out of town. "You must come at once, dear friend," her letter had said. "A man of poison, dead by poison? It reeks of theatre, but I suspect something far colder. Lionel Gudgeon was no fool, and he had secrets. I'm sure of it." Hercule Poirot, ever sensitive to dramatic irony, found the letter irresistible. Now, as he stepped inside the quiet shop, nodding politely to the officers and brushing a speck of imaginary dust from his sleeve, he inhaled deeply. "Ammonia, iodine, and something else," he murmured. "Something else, sir?" asked Inspector Flint, rising from beside the body. Poirot smiled faintly. "Regret, perhaps, or fear. These things, you see, they leave a scent of their own." Flint offered a weary nod. "You'll be wanting the details. We found him this morning. No one saw him after 7 p.m. last night. Door was locked from the inside. Nothing stolen. No suicide note. We've confiscated every bottle and vial, but most are legitimate, except for this." He held up a small metal vial, the one found near the body. "No label. Unregistered. We don't know what was in it." Poirot examined it without touching. "May I see the assistant? Miss Renfield?" "She's waiting upstairs, a bit shaken." Poirot nodded slowly, tapping one finger against his chin. "Then let us ascend, Inspector, for the good chemist may no longer speak, but the living, the living, they often say too much." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped past the cordon and into the deeper mystery of the chemist's secret. Poirot mounted the narrow staircase with deliberate care, each footfall placed with the precision of a man who found disorder personally offensive. Inspector Flint followed behind, less graceful and more impatient, his heavy boots creaking against the wooden steps. The upstairs rooms were modest, a far cry from grandeur, a sitting room with well-thumbed medical texts, a breakfast table laid for one, and a wall clock ticking with unnatural loudness in the hush that followed the events of the morning. Miss Alma Renfield sat on a worn settee by the window, her gloved hands clasped in her lap. She was a tall woman in her late 20s, with an intelligent face made severe by tension. Her ash-blonde hair was drawn into a tight chignon, and her grey chemist's coat was still buttoned to the throat. She looked up as the men entered, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp. Poirot bowed gently. "Mademoiselle, I am Hercule Poirot. Permit me a few small questions." "I've already spoken with the inspector," she said, her voice clipped. "Twice." Poirot gave a slight incline of the head. "Oui, and yet, perhaps there is something you do not yet realize you know. The truth, mademoiselle, is often like a misplaced bottle. One sees it every day, yet does not grasp its significance until someone points it out." She hesitated, then nodded. "Good. Now tell me, you worked for Monsieur Gudgeon for how long?" 3 years, she said. "He hired me after my father passed. I had studied pharmacology, but couldn't afford to finish my degree. Mr. Gudgeon said I had talent and precision. He trusted me." Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "And was this trust returned?" She flinched. "I respected him. He was exacting, yes, very particular, but fair. He always insisted the labels be handwritten. He said typed ones lacked soul." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "the vial found near his body was not labelled at all." She looked down, jaw tightening. "I saw that. I have never seen that vial before." Poirot sat delicately on the edge of a high-backed chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Tell me, mademoiselle, when did you last see him alive?" "Yesterday evening. I locked up at 6:30. He was still in the back lab, as usual, working on something. He told me to leave the till reconciled and the ledgers on the counter." Poirot glanced at Flint. "And this she did?" "Yes," Flint grunted. "Ledger was there, till balanced, no signs of tampering." Poirot returned his gaze to Alma. "And when you left, was he well?" "He was distracted, edgy. He had been for days, snapping at customers, misplacing things. I thought it was stress. He had received some letter a few days ago that upset him." Poirot perked slightly. "A letter?" "Yes. Pale blue envelope. He opened it and went completely still. He tore it up immediately, but for the rest of the day he was silent." Poirot clasped his hands. "And you recall nothing of the handwriting or any names?" She shook her head. "I only saw the envelope. No return address." He rose. "Merci, Mademoiselle Renfield. For now, that is all." She seemed about to say something more, then thought better of it. As they stepped back into the corridor, Poirot paused near the coat stand. A simple umbrella hung from one hook, and beside it, an overcoat with a faint chemical scent. "She is frightened," Poirot murmured. "Of what?" Flint asked. "She's not under suspicion." "Ah," said Poirot, finger raised. "But in matters of crime, the innocent are often most afraid, for they know only too well that truth can look guilty, if told clumsily." They descended once more, returning to the ground floor, where the front shop had been cordoned off. A middle-aged man in a tweed suit waited near the threshold, hat in hand, eyes darting toward the shop counter. "Ah," Flint said, "this is Mr. Clive Halberd, estate solicitor. Says he's been handling Mr. Gudgeon's affairs." "Not precisely," Halberd corrected. He was a tall, narrow man with pale eyebrows and a nervous tick in his cheek. "I managed Mr. Gudgeon's personal trust. He rarely updated his records, but last month he asked to meet. Said he wished to change his will." Poirot studied him. "To whom was the previous will bequeathed?" Halberd swallowed. "All to a cousin in Sussex, a Mr. Piers Gudgeon, who hasn't spoken to Lionel in 20 years. A man of poor repute, but Lionel wished to change it. He wanted to leave everything to a Miss Julia Caro." Flint blinked. "Who's she?" "She was a patient. Not a relation, not a business associate. Just someone he visited regularly. He never told me more." Poirot glanced toward the shelves. What ailment did this Mademoiselle Caro suffer from? "I wouldn't know," said Halberd, "but I did hear her name, twice. Mr. Gudgeon mentioned her in passing, as someone with a good soul." "Where can she be found?" "She lives with her mother in Willowbank Lane, near the edge of town." Poirot turned to Flint. "Inspector, I think it would be of great interest to speak with this mysterious Mademoiselle Caro." They left the shop and stepped into the street once more. The rain had started, soft and deliberate. Poirot opened his umbrella with a neat flick of the wrist. As they made their way toward Willowbank Lane, Poirot said nothing for several minutes. "You are silent, Monsieur Poirot," Flint noted at last. Poirot's eyes remained fixed ahead. "There is too much order in that chemist's shop. Too much neatness. A man may be tidy in life, yes, but in death the scene always speaks. In this case, it is whispering, and I do not yet like what it says." Willowbank Lane was a narrow road flanked with willows, their long fronds dripping water like sighs from forgotten trees. Number 14 was a brick cottage with a rose garden gone to seed. A woman in her early 30s answered the door, her dark hair swept up in a careless bun, her skin pale but unblemished. "Miss Julia Caro?" Poirot asked. She nodded, wary. "I am Hercule Poirot. We come regarding Mr. Lionel Gudgeon." Her face changed at once. "He's dead, isn't he?" she said quietly. Poirot's brows rose. "You know already?" "I saw the constable in the square, and then I knew. He told me last week. He said he felt his time was running short." Poirot tilted his head. "He told you this?" "Yes." Her voice trembled now. "He used to bring my mother's prescriptions. She's bedridden, but he stayed to talk, always. Said kindness was the only real medicine left in the world." Poirot softened. "And were you close?" She flushed. "I respected him. He was a good man, but something troubled him. The last time he visited, he asked me if I believed in redemption. He looked like he hadn't slept." Poirot gave a slight bow. "Merci, mademoiselle. We shall not trouble you further, but you may yet hear from me again." As they walked away from the cottage, Inspector Flint frowned. "What do you think, Poirot? Was she the reason he changed his will?" Poirot gave a slight smile. "Ah, Inspector, the heart is a more dangerous thing than poison. But remember, a man does not fear death unless he has cause. Something pursued Lionel Gudgeon, and I intend to discover what it was. Rain tapped gently against Poirot's hat as they turned back toward the town. Already pieces of the puzzle were shifting, but the picture, as yet, remained maddeningly incomplete. By the time they returned to the chemist's shop, the rain had eased to a misting drizzle, casting a silvery sheen over the cobblestones. Poirot stepped lightly over a puddle near the curb, removed a speck of lint from his cuff, and stood for a long moment outside the shop window, peering inside as if it were a stage, and the tragedy within merely the first act of a longer play. Inside, Inspector Flint was greeted by Constable Shepherd, who had been gathering statements from bystanders. "A few more witnesses have come forward," he said. "Mostly chatter, but one or two details might interest you." Poirot made no comment, but inclined his head slightly, as if granting permission for the facts to present themselves. Shepherd flipped open his notebook. "The baker's boy, young Henry Gibbons, says he saw someone leave the back alley around 9 o'clock last night. Couldn't see the face clearly, but said it was a man in a dark overcoat with a limp." Flint raised an eyebrow. "A limp?" "Yes, sir. Like he dragged his right foot a little." Poirot's eyes flicked to Flint, as Monsieur Gudgeon himself did. "Precisely," said Shepherd. "But if Mr. Gudgeon was already dead by then someone wished to appear as him," Poirot finished, his voice quiet. "Or misdirect suspicion altogether," Flint added, thoughtful. Poirot stepped past them into the back room. He had been there once already, but now he studied it differently, not as a scene of death, but as a place of living habit. The workbench was immaculately organized. Mortar and pestle wiped clean, measuring spoons laid out by size, and yet something pricked at his sense of order. He scanned the open drawer beside the bench. "Monsieur Flint," he said suddenly, "you see here the drawer marked arsenicals, and yet it is empty." Flint leaned in. "Do we know if Gudgeon used arsenic recently?" "We do not," Poirot replied, "but I suspect someone else may have." He walked toward the far wall, where a tall cabinet stood locked. Poirot examined the keyhole, then withdrew a small envelope from his breast pocket. With the precision of a surgeon, he poured a fine dust, graphite powder, into the key slot. "I do not open it," he said. "I simply observe. You see, Inspector, this lock has been used recently. A fine scuff mark around the keyhole, too clean for an old cabinet." Flint nodded slowly, "Which suggests someone accessed it after hours." "Just so," Poirot murmured. The air in the room held the faintest bitterness, a chemical ghost of something recently handled. Poirot turned toward the shelves, studying the labels. Ammonium chloride, belladonna, digitalis, all accounted for. "All but one," he said softly. He stepped out into the shop again, just as the door creaked open, and a breathless figure entered, umbrella dripping. He was ruddy-faced, with white hair, and a voice like someone perpetually apologizing. "Forgive me," he gasped. "I heard what happened. Is it true? Lionel, he's gone?" "And you are?" asked Flint. "Archibald Stokes. I'm the town's dentist. Lionel and I were, well, friends of a sort. We met every fortnight for chess and brandy. He was due to visit me last night, but he never came." Poirot studied the man carefully. "Did you speak recently?" "Yes, yesterday afternoon. He said he had something to show me, something that would rewrite everything. That was his phrase. I pressed him for more, but he only said it concerned the past, and that he needed to come clean." Flint rubbed his chin. "Did he seem afraid?" Stokes nodded grimly. "Terrified. Said he couldn't sleep, that he kept hearing voices in the walls. I thought it was the war returning to him. He had terrible nights sometimes, nightmares, but this felt different." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Voices in the walls, monsieur?" "Yes. He said it started after he found the letter." Poirot turned quickly. "Ah, another reference to the letter, and still it eludes us." Stokes shifted uncomfortably. I don't know more. He was a private man, but he did mention something else. He said, if anything happens to me, there are records. They'll explain everything. Poirot's eyes lit with sudden energy. Records. Then we must find them. Where would he keep them? Asked Flint. No safe was found on the premises. Poirot was already moving, his mind ticking through the details like a chessboard. He stopped at the base of the stairs and looked up once more, then turned abruptly toward the sitting room above. Once there, he examined the small breakfast table and its modest drawers. He opened each with fastidious care. Nothing. Until, in the last drawer, beneath old invoices and a pressed flower bookmark, he found a slim black notebook. It was unlabeled, its cover plain and worn. He opened it. Inside were lists, names, dates, coded notations, and above all, formulae. He scanned quickly, pages turning beneath his fingertips, until a line caught his eye. Caro, tincture recalibrated, strength lowered, no charge. He paused, then flipped further. Another line. Renfield, observed browsing through the arsenicals, uncertain intentions. And then, deeper still, Piers, letter received, demands silence, threatens exposure, will not be blackmailed. Poirot turned the final page. It bore only one sentence, written in hurried, slanted script. If I am found dead, it will not be by my own hand. Poirot closed the notebook carefully. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up and said, It is time we speak with this cousin, n'est-ce pas? Piers Gudgeon. Back downstairs, he handed the notebook to Flint. This is what the killer feared. Not fortune, not sentiment, but exposure. Someone wanted this record silenced. Flint nodded grimly. We'll send a wire to Sussex at once. But Poirot raised one finger. No need, mon ami. If I am correct, Monsieur Pierre is already in Kettering Vale. Flint blinked. You think he came back? I do, Poirot said, because the chemist was not just murdered. He was warned, and he chose to stay silent, which means the killer needed to act swiftly. And what better place to hide, he added, than in plain sight? Outside, the mist had begun to lift, and in the receding fog, Poirot saw the outline of a man leaning against a lamp-post just beyond the constable's cordon. He wore a dark overcoat and held a cigarette with a trembling hand. He limped slightly when he walked. Poirot did not rush. He stood behind the window glass of the chemist's shop, one hand lightly touching the sill, his eyes narrowed on the figure outside, the man with the cigarette and the awkward gait. A shadow in a dark overcoat, indistinct but suggestive. Poirot had always believed that a man's body held his secrets more plainly than his words. This man's posture was not idle. It was measured, not that of a passer-by, but of someone watching, deciding, waiting. Inspector Flint joined him at the window. You think that's Piers Gudgeon? Poirot made a soft sound. I think it is a man who has been waiting for something. And now, seeing the activity within, he realizes time is no longer on his side. Flint motioned to Shepherd, who exited the shop with a purpose. The man outside saw him coming and flicked the cigarette away too quickly. He turned to walk, but the limp gave him away. Poirot and Flint stepped outside, just as Shepherd laid a hand on the man's shoulder. He turned slowly, with a smirk that did not reach his eyes. What's all this, then? Your name? Shepherd asked. Piers Gudgeon, he replied with no attempt at deception. I suppose you've been expecting me. Poirot stepped forward, and the man's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition or perhaps calculation behind his hooded eyes. He was younger than Lionel, by perhaps 15 years, with thinning black hair and a long jaw sharpened by bitterness. You were estranged from your cousin, Poirot said. Estranged is polite, Piers muttered. He cut me off 30 years ago. Not a letter, not a penny. And yet, he glanced toward the shop. He died in the business our grandfather built. I suppose that's fitting. And yet you are here in Kettering Vale. I came to collect what's mine. Poirot arched a brow. You were under the impression the will favoured you? I assumed it would, Piers said, eyes flicking away, until I heard rumours he'd changed it. To a girl of all people. A shop girl. Julia something. Caro, Poirot supplied. Piers shrugged. I met her once. She thanked him like he'd saved her soul. I knew then he was going soft. And so you came, Poirot said, not to grieve, but to protest. Piers' tone hardened. I came to see the document, and to speak with Lionel. I never got the chance. They say he died last night. I arrived this morning. But someone saw you, Poirot said gently. Last night, leaving the alley behind the shop. You walked with a limp, monsieur. It is not easily mistaken. Piers' jaw clenched. You're mistaken. I was at the Blue Fern, the inn. I arrived late, yes, but I went straight there. Poirot's voice remained light. And do you have a receipt? A witness? The innkeeper. Ask him. He'll vouch for it. We shall, Flint said, his tone cooler than Poirot's. Poirot took a step closer, tilting his head. And the letter, Monsieur Goujon, the one you sent threatening exposure? Piers' mask slipped for a second. I don't know what you mean. Poirot held his gaze. You do, and you know what it said, even if you deny writing it. Tell me, monsieur, what had your cousin done that so infuriated you? What secret did you threaten to reveal? Piers scoffed. He was a fraud, that's all. Poirot remained still. In what way? Piers gave a humourless laugh. He wasn't qualified, not fully. He never completed his licensure. He used forged credentials to open that shop after the war. Flint blinked. That's not in any public record. Because he made sure of it, Piers said coldly. He stole someone else's certification, an old friend who died in France. Changed the names. I discovered it years later, quite by accident. And you waited, Poirot said. Why? Piers' voice dropped to a hiss. Because I thought one day I might need the truth. And I did. Poirot folded his arms. And when your cousin refused to yield to blackmail, you decided to force his hand another way? I didn't kill him, Piers snapped, then caught himself, breathing heavily. I wanted what I was owed. That's all. Poirot regarded him in silence. Let us hope, monsieur, that your alibi is as firm as your conviction. They let him go for the moment, escorted back to the inn by Shepherd to verify his story. Poirot said little as they returned inside, but his mind was busy. He stood again in the shop, hands clasped behind his back, walking the line of glass bottles with slow, deliberate steps. Why did Lionel not go to the authorities? He asked aloud, to no one in particular. Flint, who was writing in his notebook, looked up. Pride? Perhaps. Or guilt, or fear of unravelling everything he built. He paused at the back wall. The cabinet still stood open. He looked at the bottles again, then turned to the counter. Suddenly, Poirot's gaze sharpened. A small metal tray, innocuous, had been pushed to one side beneath a slip of paper. He lifted the paper and studied the tray beneath. It bore a faint powdery residue. White, almost invisible. He took out his monocle, leaned closer, and frowned. Flint, have you catalogued every bottle in this shop? Yes. Then please confirm, was scopolamine listed? Flint turned to the evidence ledger, flipping quickly. Number not here. Should it be? Poirot turned toward him. It was here. That powder. It has the faint shine of scopolamine base, a dangerous compound, used in minute doses for motion sickness or surgical sedation. But in excess, it creates confusion, docility, and in certain forms, death. Flint stiffened. You think that's what killed him? I believe it was administered, silently, through a dropper, perhaps into tea. There was no struggle, no signs of distress, only sudden collapse. This, he tapped the tray, was a staging ground. He looked out the window again, past the milling townsfolk and the sullen grey sky. The killer was not angry, Poirot said softly. They were calm. They knew where the vial was kept. They timed the moment. And most of all, they knew how to cover the scent. Flint frowned. You're suggesting it wasn't Piers? I am suggesting, Poirot replied, that while Piers threatened exposure, another feared it more. He turned sharply. Bring me Miss Alma Renfield, again. 10 minutes later, Alma stood before him in the sitting room. This time, Poirot did not sit. Mademoiselle, he said gently, you worked closely with Lionel Gudgeon. You understood his habits, his methods. You had access to every cabinet, every vial. She nodded, tense. You say he was distracted, disturbed, and you say he dismissed you early. Yes. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And yet he had never done so before. She blinked. No, he hadn't. I thought perhaps... You thought he feared what was coming. Her composure faltered. Yes. Poirot gave her no time to recover. But he trusted you, not just with his shop, but with his conscience. You were aware of his secret, were you not? That he had forged his license? She hesitated. He told me. Not directly, but I found a letter years ago, one he had half burned in the stove. I pieced it together. I confronted him. He begged me to stay silent. And you did, Poirot said, until recently. She looked down, lips trembling. He promised to confess. He was going to write to the licensing board, to give up the practice and retire. He said he wanted to die clean. Poirot's voice was very quiet. And did that frighten you? She looked up sharply. Why would it? Because if he gave up the shop, Poirot said, you would be left with nothing. Alma's face went pale. That's not true. But you knew he had changed his will, not in your favor, to a young woman he barely knew. And so, you were not merely losing the shop, you were losing the future you had imagined. No, she whispered. I would never... Poirot raised one hand. I do not accuse, not yet. But I tell you this, Mademoiselle Renfield, the killer was not driven by rage. They were driven by preservation, and you, above all others, understood how to deliver poison without leaving a trace. Alma took a step back, shaking her head. Poirot did not move. The scopolamine is gone, he said, but the tray remains. You did not expect us to look for it. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice stayed firm. I didn't kill him. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps not. But I wonder, mademoiselle, did you help cover for someone who did? Alma didn't answer at first. Her fingers, still gloved, trembled slightly as they found each other at her waist. Poirot watched in silence, letting the stillness press upon her like the walls of a narrowing corridor. Behind her, the faded curtains stirred in the breeze, a quiet counterpoint to the gathering tension in the room. I didn't cover for anyone, she said at last, her voice low and cracked. I didn't want to see him ruined. Not that way. He made mistakes, yes. But he was kind to me. He gave me dignity, a place in the world. I owed him that. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Yet loyalty has its limits, mademoiselle, especially when self-preservation comes calling. She flinched, but steadied herself. If you think I had anything to do with his death, you're wrong. Poirot stepped closer, his voice softening. Let us suppose I believe you. Then tell me, if it was not you who administered the poison, then who had the knowledge, the means, and the motive? She looked down, then slowly shook her head. Only someone who knew his routine intimately, who understood what he kept and where. And who might that be? I don't know, she whispered, but it wasn't me. Poirot gave a slow nod, then turned to Flint, who had been watching from the doorway. Let her go for now, Poirot said quietly. but place her under discreet observation. She may yet tell us more without meaning to." Flint nodded, and Alma slipped past them down the stairs, her shoulders rigid, her eyes dry but rimmed with something deeper than tears, fear or guilt or both. Poirot remained still for a long moment. Then he turned back into the sitting room and studied the photograph on the mantel. It showed Lionel Gudgeon in his youth, standing beside a man with a striking resemblance to peers. Brothers, perhaps, or cousins. There was a glint in Lionel's eye, in that old photo, that Poirot had not seen echoed in death. It was not the glint of happiness, but of challenge, of a man who had lived with something hidden beneath his skin, and who had finally decided, too late, to let it out. Poirot placed the photo back carefully, then addressed Flint. "We must speak with Mademoiselle Caro again. There is a thread that pulls between her and this man, one that was not spun by accident. I believe she knows more than she thinks." As they walked once more down Willowbank Lane, the trees now dripping rather than raining, Poirot seemed to grow quieter, folding deeper into himself. Flint had grown used to this by now. Poirot's silences were not empty. They were the sound of his little grey cells knitting their web. Julia Caro opened the door almost before they knocked. Her eyes were wide, not frightened but expectant, and her hands bore faint traces of chalk dust. Inside, her mother's voice called faintly from another room, asking if everything was well. Poirot inclined his head politely. "Mademoiselle, forgive the intrusion." She stepped back. "Of course. Please." They entered the small cottage again. It was unchanged, simple, clean, quiet. Poirot stood in the center of the room and studied her. "You said Lionel brought your mother's prescriptions. How often?" "Every fortnight. Sometimes more often, if she needed something adjusted." "And during these visits, you became friends?" She flushed. "Yes, he was gentle, he spoke kindly, he listened." Poirot took a step closer. "Did he confide in you, mademoiselle? Did he tell you of his past?" Julia hesitated. "Not in detail, but I could tell something weighed on him. He once said he had built his life on borrowed things. I didn't know what he meant, but then he gave me something." She crossed the room and opened a drawer beneath the window. From it, she withdrew a small brown envelope, sealed but unmarked. She held it out to Poirot. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should give this to someone who truly sought the truth." Poirot accepted the envelope delicately. He glanced at her. "May I?" She nodded. He broke the seal and withdrew the contents, a single folded page and a photograph. The photo showed a group of soldiers, young and gaunt, in a field hospital tent. Lionel stood near the center, beside another man, darker-skinned, broad-faced, wearing a surgeon's coat. The back of the photograph was inscribed, "Captain Lionel Gudgeon, Lieutenant Raymond Okoye, Ypres, 1917. The letter was brief, handwritten in Lionel's careful script. "To whoever holds this, know that I am not the man you believe. The qualifications on my wall were not earned by me, but by another, a man who saved my life, then died in my arms. His name was Raymond Okoye. I buried him and took his credentials to start again. I was a fraud, but I tried to do good. I tried to honor him. I told myself I would confess before I died. But now the past has found me, and I fear I have waited too long. If you can find his family, give them this photo. I kept it all these years. Forgive me. I tried." Poirot folded the letter in silence. Flint let out a low breath. "Well, that confirms it. Piers must have found out, blackmailed him. When that failed..." Poirot shook his head. "Number Piers is angry, yes. Desperate, but not precise, not quiet. He is not the kind of man who would measure a dose of scopolamine and wait in silence." He looked again at Julia. Did you ever tell anyone that Lionel had left you something? Anyone at all? She shook her head. Only my mother heard it, but she's not well. Poirot gave a faint nod. Then someone else must have known. Someone who saw Lionel's attachment to you and feared what he had entrusted. Flint rubbed the back of his neck. So not Piers, not Alma. Then who? Poirot turned back toward the door. That is what we must now find, because someone in this town feared Lionel's truth more than they coveted his wealth. They returned to the chemist's shop just as Constable Shepherd came running up the path. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "we just received word from the licensing board in London. Something odd. They had recently opened an inquiry into Lionel Gudgeon's credentials. A formal complaint was filed 2 weeks ago, anonymously." Flint's eyes narrowed. "Filed from where?" "Postmarked from Kettering Vale." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, south. The death was preemptive." "What do you mean?" Flint asked. "Lionel knew the inquiry was coming," Poirot said. "He knew someone had forced the board's hand, but he did not yet know who. He feared what the letter would expose. And the killer, they feared what Lionel would say in return. That is why the crime was not merely one of greed or revenge. It was strategic, timed to fall before Lionel could name them." Poirot turned toward the shelves once more. His hand hovered briefly over the bottle labeled scopolamine, then moved down, past it, to a smaller bottle, one nearly identical in shape and color. His fingers stopped. "Inspector," he said, voice low, "do you see this?" Flint leaned in. "Belladonna, another sedative." "And yet," Poirot said, "this bottle is sealed. The label is fresh. It has not been touched in weeks. It was only placed here to fill the gap." "The gap?" "Where scopolamine should have been." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, and someone hoped we wouldn't notice." He looked back toward the staircase. "Someone who had every reason to enter this room, every reason to touch this shelf. Someone we have not yet questioned fully, because we believed them too peripheral." Flint frowned. "Who?" Poirot's face was unreadable. "The doctor," he said. "Dr. Greaves. The first to declare the death natural, the first to handle the body, and the only man with the authority to enter and examine this back room before we arrived. The pieces were turning now, just barely aligning. Not yet enough for a name, but enough for a direction." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Come, Inspector. I believe it is time we asked our good doctor a few questions." Dr. Horace Greaves lived alone at the far edge of the vale, in a modest house set back from the road, half shadowed by overgrown laurels. The brass plate beside the door was polished to a sheen, as though he wiped it with ritualistic precision, yet the front step bore faint green stains from weeks of disuse. Poirot noticed such things, the contrast between public presentation and private neglect. He stepped forward, knocked twice with a controlled rap, and waited. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a tall, spare man in his late 60s, with a receding hairline, a faded waistcoat, and the vague expression of someone perpetually inconvenienced by the world. Dr. Greaves blinked once behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, then gave a stiff nod. "Mr. Poirot, Inspector. I imagine you've questions." Poirot offered a courteous bow. "Indeed, Doctor. It is not every day that a man dies mysteriously in his own chemist shop, and the first medical authority to handle the scene happens to be someone with both the trust of the town and the keys to its most precise poisons." Dr. Greaves sighed. Yes. Come in, then. Best get it over with." The sitting room was stale with the scent of camphor and tea. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with dog-eared journals and anatomical charts. Flint remained standing. Poirot accepted a chair and adjusted his cuffs with his usual care. "You were called to examine Mr. Gudgeon's body the morning he was found." "I was." "You declared the cause of death to be poisoning, yet could not determine the substance." That's correct. There were no obvious signs, no cyanosis, no abdominal distension. His expression was calm. In the absence of trauma or evidence of accident, poisoning was the only reasonable conclusion. Yet you made no mention of scopolamine. Dr. Greaves folded his arms. Because it would have been conjecture. Scopolamine leaves very little trace in visible examination. You'd need a laboratory for confirmation, and I have no such equipment. I gave the only answer I could. Poirot gave a subtle nod, and in the meantime, the body was moved. By your suggestion? To allow the shop to be cleared and the area restored? Yes. An odd urgency, Poirot said, eyes narrowing, especially for a man who, as you admit, could not identify the poison. Greaves' voice hardened. Do you suggest I tampered with the scene? Poirot's tone remained light. I suggest nothing, Doctor. I observe, and I ask, were you ever granted access to Lionel Gudgeon's private records? No. But you were close enough, surely, Poirot said. You saw him regularly. You shared patients. You consulted on prescriptions. You knew his methods. Greaves gave a tight nod. I did. Poirot stood slowly. And you knew of the anonymous letter, the one sent to the licensing board. The doctor didn't flinch, but the silence that followed was answer enough. I suspected, he said at last. Poirot tilted his head. You suspected, or you wrote it? Greaves gave a bitter laugh. What does it matter now? The truth was going to come out, whether I wrote the letter or not. The man practiced under false credentials. I took an oath, Monsieur Poirot, to protect the public, not the pride of a fraud. And yet, Poirot said softly, you remained silent for years. I did, Greaves replied, because he did no harm, because he worked carefully, because I believed in his integrity, until I saw him turn the chemist's shop into a stage for his vanity, training a young assistant without license, changing his will to leave it to a girl with no qualifications, leaving behind chaos for the rest of us to clean up. Poirot said nothing. Greaves went on, voice low. I confronted him, a week before his death. I asked him to step down quietly. He said no, said he would confess, yes, but not resign. He would rewrite his story on his terms. He thought confession would redeem him. It wouldn't. Poirot stepped closer. And so? Greaves met his eyes. So I wrote the board. I told myself that was justice, but I didn't kill him. I was angry, yes, but not enough to murder. Flint interjected then, sharp. You had access. You knew about the compounds. You were alone in that shop before anyone else arrived. I examined the body, yes, but I didn't remove anything. And if you think I tampered with the tray you mentioned, he pointed a finger at Poirot. I assure you, I did not. I saw no tray. Poirot studied him. Perhaps, or perhaps you saw more than you let on. The silence in the room grew heavier. Outside, a single bird sang briefly, then fell silent again. Poirot turned. One last question, Doctor. Have you ever prescribed scopolamine to Miss Alma Renfield? Greaves blinked, caught off guard. Alma? Number never. Why? Because a residue of the compound was found on a tray near the rear of the shop, and someone with no prescription rights must have had access. You say you never prescribed it. Lionel is dead. Alma says she...
This created a constant demand for fresh victims, fueling a massive human trafficking network that extended throughout the empire and into neighbouring countries. The economic documentation reveals the cold calculation behind this system. Imperial accountants maintained detailed cost-benefit analyses, comparing the expense of acquiring new concubines versus the cost of keeping existing ones alive and healthy. These spreadsheets of human misery preserved in the Imperial Financial Archive treated women as depreciating assets, with quantifiable utility values based on their remaining sexual usefulness. Perhaps most chilling was the development of what court documents called sexual inheritance taxes. When wealthy families wanted to curry favour with the emperor, They would offer their daughters as tribute, but the imperial treasury developed a complex tax system that essentially forced families to pay for the privilege of having their daughters enslaved and abused. This created a perverse economic incentive where the empire profited not just from the women's sexual exploitation, but from their families' desperation to maintain imperial favour. The system also included elaborate insurance policies for the emperor's sexual satisfaction. If a concubine failed to please the emperor or died before fulfilling her expected service period, her family could be held financially liable for the replacement cost, plus penalties. This created a secondary economy of sexual debt that could financially destroy entire family lines, ensuring that the empire's need for fresh victims was constantly supplied by families desperate to avoid economic ruin. The ultimate expression of imperial sexual power wasn't pleasure. It was the authority to destroy human beings through sexual means, creating what court documents euphemistically called terminal intimacy. The secret annals of Emperor Kangxi describe a systematic program of sexual execution that combined the emperor's carnal desires with his absolute power over life and death, creating ceremonies that were simultaneously orgies and mass murders. Emperor Kangxi developed what he called the ritual of final submission, a ceremony where condemned women would be forced to participate in increasingly violent sexual acts until they died from their injuries. Court physicians were required to attend these events not to provide medical care, but to ensure that the women remained conscious and capable of suffering for as long as possible. These weren't executions that happened to involve sexual violence. They were sexual acts specifically designed to kill, with death itself becoming the ultimate form of imperial sexual gratification. The emperor's personal chambers contained devices that modern forensic analysis would classify as sexual torture instruments, but court records describe them as enhancement tools for imperial pleasure. According to surviving technical diagrams from the imperial workshop, these devices were designed to cause maximum physical trauma while maintaining the
Asked for a tonic. He said he was having trouble sleeping. I mixed him something mild, valerian mostly. And did you add anything else? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Alma, Poirot said softly, you did not kill him, but you enabled it. Her breath caught. You left the tonic by the stair. You didn't see him take it, but someone else did. Her eyes filled. Who, Alma? Who came that night? She whispered it. Julia. Poirot stepped back, the pieces falling at last into place. She had the motive, the inheritance, the story of redemption, and she had Lionel's trust. She only needed access, and you gave it to her, without meaning to. Alma nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. She told me he was tired, that she'd help him rest. I never thought. Poirot placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You wanted to protect him, but she wanted to replace him. Outside, the bell above the door jingled as Poirot stepped into the gathering dusk. Come, Inspector, he said. It is time we speak with Mademoiselle Julia Caro, not as a witness, but as the last suspect remaining. The sun was beginning its descent as Hercule Poirot and Inspector Flint made their way once more along the winding path of Willowbank Lane. The air had shifted, a touch crisper, the light burnished to gold. The quiet of the countryside seemed heavier now, like a hush before a final chord in a long, unsettling symphony. Number 14 stood as it had before, brick-faced, modest, wrapped in roses and shadows. Yet this time, Poirot's step was more deliberate. The pieces had aligned in his mind with the terrible clarity he always dreaded and respected. It was never joy he took in the final moments of a case, only gravity. Julia Caro answered the door again. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair loose now around her face. She looked tired, perhaps expectant, but not afraid. Mr. Poirot, she said, her voice gentle, you've come back. Indeed, mademoiselle. Poirot said softly. "May we come in?" She stepped aside without hesitation. Inside, the same hush of warm tea and lavender greeted them. The curtains had been drawn slightly against the setting sun. Poirot's eyes swept the room, taking in the details once more, not with curiosity, but with conclusion. Her mother's frail voice echoed faintly from the back room. Julia glanced that way and then turned back to them. "Is something wrong?" Poirot nodded to Flint, who stood at the doorway as a silent witness, and then approached the centre of the sitting-room. He did not sit. "Mademoiselle Caro," he began with soft precision, "when last we spoke, you gave me an envelope that Lionel entrusted to you. A letter of confession, a photograph. You said he wished to make peace with his past." Julia nodded slowly. "Yes, that's true. And yet," Poirot continued, "there is more. Lionel had promised to change his will, to name you as his heir. This is not rumour, it is fact confirmed by his solicitor. A chemist's shop, a livelihood, a legacy. That is no small inheritance for a young woman with neither license nor training." She hesitated. "He believed in me." "Oui," Poirot said gently. "He believed in you, and you saw in him a path out of hardship. You saw in his affection something that could be your future, and perhaps, in your heart, you believed you had earned it." She said nothing. Poirot took another step. But Lionel was having doubts. He told Dr. Greaves he would confess, that he would resign, and if he resigned, the chemist's shop would close. The will would be delayed. The legacy would be lost, she finished, her voice low. Poirot's tone remained calm. "So, you acted. Not out of hatred, not even out of greed, but out of fear. Fear that the one chance you had been given, a rare, extraordinary chance, would disappear." Julia's lips parted, then closed again. Her eyes glittered. Poirot walked slowly to the edge of the small writing desk. "On the night he died, you came to the chemist's. Alma had left early. Lionel was upstairs. You brought the tonic she had prepared. Or rather, you replaced it. The scopolamine you stole was already measured, diluted. You poured it into the glass, perhaps mixing it with tea or wine. Something gentle, something he wouldn't question." Julia's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. Poirot's voice dropped further. "You knew his trust was absolute. You knew he would not test it, and so he drank. And later that night, while the effects set in, he drifted into confusion and death. Silence. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock on the mantel." Poirot turned slowly to face her. "You did not mean to kill him violently, but you knew what that dosage would do. You knew he would not wake, and more importantly, you knew that Alma would assume guilt before suspicion reached you." Flint stepped forward now, voice gruff. "Why didn't you run when you heard we were investigating?" Julia looked up. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Because I didn't think you'd find it. I thought it would be enough to make it look like heart failure. The doctor said there were no signs. I didn't touch anything else." Poirot gave a small, weary nod. "That is the danger of cleverness, mademoiselle. It tempts one to believe in invisibility." She moved to the window then, slowly, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I never wanted to hurt him." "I believe you," Poirot said simply. "I thought if I could just keep it all together, the story would hold. I would run the shop. I would keep his legacy. I would live quietly. No one would need to know." Poirot approached, but not too near. "You thought the lie would redeem the truth. But the truth, mademoiselle, always demands to be seen." She turned, finally, and the tears came now. Not in sobs, but a silent, glistening confession. "I loved him," she whispered. "Not like that, not romantically, but for what he was, what he gave us, my mother, my sanity, my purpose. I couldn't lose it all, not again." Poirot stood still. "I was tired of watching things slip away," she said. "He told me once that he built his life on borrowed things, and I thought maybe I could borrow a little too." Poirot turned to Flint. The inspector gave a short nod and stepped forward. "Julia Caro, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Lionel Gudgeon. You have the right to remain silent." But Poirot raised one hand. "Monsieur," he said softly. "Wait. Not here." Flint hesitated, then nodded. They gave her a moment. She went to the back room, a quiet exchange with her mother, a few soft words. Then she returned with a coat draped over her shoulders and no resistance in her step. They walked her out into the dusk. Poirot lingered at the door, his eyes sweeping the lane one last time. The drooping willows, the stone walls, the chimneys of modest houses puffing smoke into the evening air. Life would go on here, as it always did. Later, in the quiet of his rented room above the inn, Poirot sat with a pot of tea cooling beside him and the photograph of the two soldiers on the desk. He stared at their faces, Lionel and Raymond, one buried, one borrowed. Poirot sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It is always the same," he murmured aloud. "A lie for the sake of love, a truth buried for the sake of hope, and always someone pays." He placed the photo gently in an envelope, sealed it, and addressed it carefully to the Okoye family, Lagos, Nigeria. It would be sent in the morning. As Poirot extinguished the lamp and the room faded into shadow, he allowed himself one final thought, not of guilt, nor justice, nor even triumph, but of the fragile, foolish, very human longing to rewrite the past, even if only for a moment. The following morning broke gently over Kettering Vale, with low-hanging mist curling along the hedgerows and the narrow lanes slick with dew. It was a quiet sort of day, the kind that softened memories and dulled the sharpest of truths. In the breakfast-room of the Blue Fern Inn, Hercule Poirot sat alone, neatly dressed as always, his napkin folded with mathematical precision, a single boiled egg untouched before him. He had not come to eat. Inspector Flint arrived at 8:30, cap in hand, the lines under his eyes deeper than the morning before. He sat opposite Poirot without a word for a long minute, then finally sighed. "Caro's confession matches the timeline," he said. "We found the dropper in her garden shed, wrapped in a cloth, tucked behind a broken flower pot. No fingerprints, but the glass was clean. Too clean. Someone who knew how to cover their tracks." Poirot nodded once, slowly. "She was careful, yes, but not clinical. There were errors, small ones. The tray, the placement of the substitute bottle, the inconsistency in Alma's account. A professional killer would have erased those." Flint ran a hand over his stubble. "She's not what I expected. I think part of me still wanted it to be Piers." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "because he was unpleasant, loud, full of venom." Flint gave a humorless smile. "Exactly." Poirot's gaze was steady. "But guilt is not always noisy. Sometimes it is polite, quiet, even gentle." He turned to the window then, watching a milk cart rattle down the cobbled street. "There is one more matter I wish to address before I leave this place," he said. Flint leaned forward. "Another suspect?" "No," Poirot said. "A truth unspoken, one not of criminality, but of responsibility." Flint frowned. "You mean Alma?" Poirot nodded. "She did not kill Lionel. She did not even suspect the method. But she enabled it, through silence, through omission, through the wish to believe that goodness would prevail if left untouched." He folded his napkin precisely. "We must speak with her, not to accuse, but to confront, to ensure that what happened is not repeated by the weight of what was not said." They made their way once again to the chemist's shop, which now stood shuttered behind temporary police tape. Inside, Alma Renfield sat at the back counter, ledgers open in front of her, though her pen had not moved for several minutes. When she looked up, the dullness in her eyes told Poirot that she already knew. "I heard about Julia," she said quietly. Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Yes." Alma rose, folded her arms. "You want to know why I didn't say anything? Why I let her in? Why I left early?" Poirot remained still. "If you wish to speak, I will listen." "I didn't know," she said. "I swear it. But I should have. She was too eager, too grateful. Lionel trusted her, and I thought, maybe she deserved that. Maybe I'd had my chance and she hadn't." "You pitied her," Poirot said. "Yes, and I was jealous too. Not because of the shop, but because he chose her. To carry on the work. The quiet part of me thought, if he died, at least his legacy would live on through her. But I never imagined she would—" She stopped, a tremor in her jaw. Poirot stepped forward, voice soft. "Mademoiselle, guilt is not always the mark of crime, but it is the echo of conscience, and conscience must not sleep." She nodded, lips pressed tightly. Poirot left her then, with no reprimand, no further inquiry. That, he believed, would be punishment enough. A lifetime lived beside the knowledge of a moment too late. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly. The town felt smaller in the daylight. Children walked to school with satchels and skipping ropes. A grocer opened his shutters. Somewhere a dog barked, insistently, joyfully. Poirot and Flint walked in silence for a stretch, past the town square, past the old church where the Gudgeon family vault sat behind iron gates. It was there that Poirot paused. "Have they buried him yet?" he asked. Flint shook his head. "Tomorrow, I believe. Family service. Sparse." Poirot regarded the gate. He wished to die with dignity. That was clear. But the past does not permit us to choose the manner of our legacy. It catches up, always. He looked up at the sky, squinting slightly. "I have sent his photograph to Nigeria, to the family of the man whose name he wore." Flint was quiet. Poirot added, "I do not know if they will answer, but they deserve the truth. We all do." The inspector rubbed his jaw. "And what happens now?" "Now?" Poirot straightened his cuffs. "Now, you see that justice is done with compassion. Julia Caro will face her trial, but it is not merely law she must answer to. It is the life she took and the lives she reshaped." He turned to Flint. "You will ensure that the shop passes not into silence, but into truth, that the board receives full notice, that Alma, if she chooses, is allowed to study formally, that Raymond Okoye's name is acknowledged somewhere in this town, that these things are not buried again." Flint looked down, then back at Poirot. "You'll be leaving then?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I believe the trains are still punctual in this part of England, and I have a fondness for lemon tea on mid-morning carriages." They parted near the station. Poirot carried no more than a small case, his shoes gleaming in the rising light. As he boarded, he did not look back at the town, only forward. Inside the carriage, he took the window seat, opened his notebook, and with great care wrote the final sentence of his observations. The chemist died trying to confess. The assistant remained silent out of misplaced loyalty. The doctor saw too much too late, and the girl who wanted to inherit hope mistook love for possession. In the end, it was not a matter of poisons, but of borrowed lives. Poirot closed the notebook, folded his hands neatly atop it, and looked out across the passing fields. A small smile touched his lips. "It is done," he murmured to himself, and still, the heart, the heart, remains the greatest mystery of all. The train rocked gently as it moved through the emerald countryside, its rhythm steady and unhurried. Poirot sat quietly, his arms folded, his gaze distant yet alert, as if the thoughts behind his eyes had not yet settled into order. The small notebook still rested on the seat beside him, unopened since the last line had been written, but its weight, symbolic more than physical, lingered. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered over a folded map, the girl pointing to something with enthusiasm, while her companion nodded absently, his eyes drifting toward the window. A few rows behind them, an elderly woman knitted silently. Poirot took it all in, the tiny scenes, the casual choreography of life moving forward, untroubled by what had come to pass in Kettering Vale. And yet Poirot's mind had not left the chemist's shop. Not entirely. The case, by every visible measure, was resolved. Julia Carew had confessed. The dropper had been found. Alma Renfield had confirmed the timeline. The motives were clear. The method had been reconstructed with precision. Even Piers Gudgeon had been eliminated as a suspect. His lies exposed not as tools of murder, but of wounded pride. Still, something itched at Poirot's composure. Not a fact left unsolved, but a feeling, faint as a scent on an old coat, that one thread remained unknotted. It was not doubt in the guilt of Julia Carew. Her actions were real, her confession sincere, but Poirot's experience had taught him that sincerity and truth were not always synonyms. He leaned back, letting the motion of the train lull his senses not into sleep, but into clarity. There had been too many layers of silence in that case, too many moments when those closest to the victim had stepped back, just as the truth was about to surface. It was as though Lionel Gudgeon's past had wrapped itself around the present with such density that even his death became part of a deeper concealment. Poirot thought again of the photograph. 2 men in a field hospital. One survived and built a life on the identity of the other. A falsehood, yes, but not one born of cruelty. Still, when Julia spoke of love, of gratitude, of opportunity, Poirot had sensed more than desperation. He had sensed calculation, a kind of practiced devotion. And now, alone with his thoughts, he questioned something he had not before. When exactly had Julia discovered Lionel's secret? It was not, he realized, when Lionel gave her the envelope. That act, that trust, had been his farewell, a gesture of peace. But her actions, the timing of the will, the manipulation of Alma, the stolen vial, they suggested a deeper awareness. Earlier, more prepared. Poirot reached for the notebook and opened it again. On one of the earlier pages he had written a list of names: Alma, Piers, Julia, Greaves. Beside Julia's name he had scribbled a small mark. Not a cross, not a tick, but a half-drawn circle. Incomplete. His pencil hovered over it now. It was then that he remembered something so faint, so small, that it had slipped past him entirely at the time, the handwriting on the back of the photograph. Captain Lionel Gudgeon, Lieutenant Raymond Okoye, Ypres, 1917. Poirot had assumed Lionel had written that note. Who else would? But now that he thought more precisely, he remembered the loops of the L in Lionel, the narrow slant of the letters. Not Lionel's handwriting at all. It had matched Julia's. He turned back to the envelope Julia had handed him, now resting in his coat pocket. He retrieved it with care and studied the front. Same hand. Poirot's mind sharpened. A possibility rose in him like a tide, one he hadn't dared entertain before. What if Julia had forged the note? What if the envelope had not been left to her at all? What if it was a prop? That would mean Julia had not only planned Lionel's death, but his legacy. She had not just killed to preserve an inheritance. She had curated his redemption. But why? Poirot whispered aloud. Not for the money. Not only. He thought again of Alma. Her devotion to Lionel was real, not a performance. But Julia had played Alma, not with threats, but with vulnerability. She had placed herself in the perfect position, the helpless girl with a dying mother, full of gratitude and reverence. Poirot had seen it before, not malice, but design. A person who learns how to be what others want. A mimic, a mirror. And if she had discovered Lionel's secret long before he told her, perhaps from letters, from papers in the house, from questions no one asked, then she had not only stolen his future, but his past. Poirot closed the notebook and stared out the window once more. He would write to Flint that evening, tell him to compare the handwriting, to examine the original photograph for signs of tampering, to question Julia's timeline again, especially when she first began spending time with Lionel, not when he began helping her, but when she first found a reason to attach herself to him. The trial would still proceed. Julia had confessed. The method was proven. But Poirot no longer believed that the crime had been spontaneous. It had not been an impulsive act of fear, but a plan, a soft, slow infiltration of trust. Julia had not simply killed to protect what she loved. She had constructed something around Lionel's death, a new identity, a noble fall, a story of redemption. She had murdered not just for gain, but for narrative, a clean legacy. And Poirot, he realized with discomfort, had nearly accepted it. The train slowed as it approached a junction. The countryside was already flattening toward the next village. Poirot tucked the notebook away, adjusted his cuffs, and straightened in his seat. There was a subtle difference between justice and truth. In this case, justice would be served. Julia would face the consequences. But truth had come late, and not from the lips of the guilty. Poirot's face remained still, but his eyes sharpened. Even after all these years, the lies people told, not out of hate, but love, remained the most dangerous of all. The train pulled into the next station with a low mechanical sigh, but Poirot remained seated, unmoving, his thoughts still caught in the quiet unravelling that had begun somewhere between Kettering Vale and the fields that now blurred past his window. The suspicion that had struck him earlier, faint as a distant chime, had matured now into conviction. Not the kind he could prove beyond the shadow of a court's doubt, perhaps, but the kind that lived in the smallest details, in inconsistencies and human tendencies, and in the peculiar silence that always followed a well-constructed lie. He folded his hands in his lap and closed his eyes for a brief moment. The deception, if he was correct, had begun long before the murder. It had begun before the inheritance, before Alma's doubts, before Julia's supposed affection for Lionel Gudgeon. It had begun the day Julia had discovered his secret, not by accident, but by design, and she had used it, not just to get close, not just to be chosen, but to build a story around herself, a story of victimhood, of quiet salvation, of false purity. Poirot reached into his breast pocket again and withdrew the envelope. He opened it gently, unfolded the photograph, and this time examined it, not for its faces, but for its frame, its corners, its weight. The ink on the back was written in a careful, upright hand, the sort of neatness one practices deliberately. It had not been written in haste. And Lionel's personal letters, which Poirot had seen in the chemist's ledgers and notes, were not written this way. There was a subtle curve to Julia's handwriting, the same elegant loop in the capital Y of Ypres as in her signature on the witness statement she had given to Flint. Poirot saw it now with clarity that made his stomach turn. The photograph had been staged and the note on the back forged, not to deceive Lionel, but to support Julia's version of his life after his death. If that was so, then her true motive had never been to save the shop, or even to maintain Lionel's illusion of redemption. She had wanted to inherit a reputation. That, Poirot thought grimly, was a more dangerous ambition than money. Money could be spent and lost, but a reputation, a crafted legacy, lived on. It was power disguised as sentiment, and Julia had cloaked herself in it like a second skin. The more he considered it, the more certain he became that she had intended to kill Lionel from the start, not to stop him from resigning, but to ensure he never rewrote the story she had already prepared. He had planned to confess, to return the name, to step out of the role she needed him to play, and that would never do. He turned again to the notebook. There he had recorded Julia's answer when he first asked how she knew Lionel was dead before anyone told her. "I saw the constable in the square, and then I knew." He had believed her. The town was small. News travelled fast. But now he saw what he should have seen then. No name had been spoken, no word of poison, no cause of death. And yet Julia had asked, "He's dead, isn't he?" Not, "What's happened?" or "Is Lionel all right?" No feigned confusion, no curiosity, just resignation, certainty. She had known. She had been waiting for that morning, and when she saw the uniform, she knew her plan had succeeded. Poirot leaned back in his seat, the ache of disappointment settling into his shoulders. He had been fooled, not by false tears or denial, but by something more subtle, a truth that had been prepared for him. Julia had not fought when confronted. She had confessed when cornered, but she had done so in the exact manner that allowed her to remain the tragic figure, the one who did wrong for love, the woman who lost everything but protected someone's memory in the process. It was calculated, and it had nearly worked. But the real Lionel Gudgeon, flawed, frightened, quietly honourable, had been reduced in her story to a symbol, and Poirot could not allow that. He made his decision. When the train reached the next station with a longer pause, he disembarked, retrieved his case, and sent a telegram before heading to the small village post office nearby. It was brief, precise, and addressed to Inspector Flint. Compare Julia Caro's handwriting to note on photo and envelope. Also ledger page 42 of Lionel's records. I believe Julia forged Lionel's farewell. Further inquiry required. H.P. He returned to the train only when the next service arrived. A later carriage, slower, more rural. He did not mind. The urgency had passed. The act was done. What remained now was a final measure of truth. 2 days later, in his London flat, Poirot received the reply. Confirmed. Handwriting on photo and envelope is Julia's. No original copy from Lionel. Will submit to magistrate. Thank you. Flint. That evening, Poirot sat at his desk, staring out over the lamplights of the city. The folder from the case rested open beside him, pages arranged in crisp order, the facts now complete. Julia Caro would still be tried. Her confession stood. But the true narrative, the methodical manipulation, the forgery, the attempt to own a man's legacy, would now be part of the record. She would not walk into history as the girl who killed for love. She would be remembered as the woman who constructed a false redemption, then murdered the only man who could contradict it. Poirot reached for the envelope addressed to the Okoye family and added a single line to the cover letter within. The photograph you see has been touched by a lie, but the man in it, Raymond Okoye, was real, and his sacrifice should not be forgotten. From one who believes in the truth, wherever it may lead, Hercule Poirot. He sealed the envelope and placed it gently in the outgoing tray. For the rest of the night, he did not read. He did not write. He simply sat by the fire, hands folded, the flames dancing in his eyes, pondering the quiet brilliance of a crime, not just of method, but of story. In the end, it was not the poison that had most disturbed him. It was the idea that someone had tried to rewrite a life so carefully, so seductively, that even he, Hercule Poirot, had come within inches of believing it. That, he thought, was the most dangerous poison of all. 3 weeks later, Hercule Poirot stood once more at the threshold of the chemist's shop in Kettering Vale, its door now unbolted, the sign freshly polished and the blinds drawn halfway to let in the early autumn sun. The quiet murmurs of villagers had softened since the storm of Julia Caro's arrest and the formal inquiry that followed. With time, as always, the rhythms of village life had resumed, steady and undeterred, as if the shop's tragic story were now just another part of its wooden walls. Inside, Alma Renfield was arranging bottles on the shelf, sleeves rolled, hands steady. The air smelled of sage and new beginnings. She turned when the door chime rang and paused at the sight of him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a quiet smile. "I didn't expect—" He bowed slightly. "Mademoiselle, I am merely a visitor today. I have come to say goodbye, properly this time." She gestured toward the small chair behind the counter. "Would you like tea?" "No," Poirot said gently. "Only a moment." She nodded and waited. "I have learned," he began, "that there are two kinds of silence, the kind born from guilt and the kind born from regret. You, I believe, have lived with both, but no longer." Alma looked away for a moment. "I replay it sometimes. The moment I let her in, the moment I turned the key and left. I should have known. I should have stayed." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "But you did not administer the poison. You did not plan the deceit. You were manipulated, not for your ignorance, but for your empathy. That is not a weakness, mademoiselle. It is a rare and dangerous kind of strength." She blinked quickly, then nodded. "They've allowed me to begin formal studies. The licensing board reviewed my history. Inspector Flint spoke for me." "Bon," Poirot said with satisfaction. "It is what Lionel would have wanted." There was a pause. "May I ask," she said after a moment, "do you believe Julia ever really cared for him?" Poirot tilted his head. "In her own way, perhaps, but not as he believed. She admired what he gave her. She desired his story. But love, mademoiselle, true love, does not erase a man to preserve his myth. It accepts the flaws. It forgives the broken parts. She did neither." Alma nodded slowly. Poirot rose. "You will keep this place honest. I know it." "I will," she said, "for Lionel and for myself." He bowed once more and left. Outside, the leaves had begun to turn. Gold and red brushed the edges of the green, and the village felt suspended in that brief pause between seasons, when endings and beginnings overlap and cannot be told apart. Poirot's journey back to London was uneventful, but as he unpacked that evening, he laid the now sealed folder on the desk and opened the letter he had received the day before. It was from Lagos. The Okoye family had written back. "We thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for returning our uncle's name to us. We did not know what had become of him in the war. That his identity gave someone a new life. It is strange, but not unforgivable. We are grateful that his photograph still lives. We will place it with the others." Poirot folded the letter slowly, with great care, and placed it beside the photograph of the two men in the field hospital. A name returned, a truth restored, a small corner of the world made right again. That evening, as he sat in his favourite chair by the fire, he allowed himself a small, rare moment of stillness. Cases came and went. Crimes repeated themselves in new disguises. But this one, the affair at the Chemist's secret, would remain with him. Not because it had challenged his logic or strained his deductive skills, but because it had reminded him once again of the fragility of human character. We build stories around ourselves, he thought, to protect, to survive, to matter. But when those stories consume others, when they demand blood to preserve illusion, then they cease to be stories and become lies. And it is the role of the detective, always, not merely to solve the crime, but to uncover the shape of that lie and to lay bare the truth beneath. He took one last sip of tea, closed his eyes, and let the fire crackle on. It was finished, and justice, though late, though imperfect, had prevailed.